Napoleone arrived back in Ajaccio on September 15th. He found his homeland in the throes of revolution no less severe than those in Paris. After reconnecting with his family, Napoleone threw himself headlong into local politics, as ever trying to secure his family's future. As a recent acquisition for the Kingdom of France, Corsica had proven difficult to govern. Not only was the island far from the metropole and separated by sea, but regional rivalries and family grudges were an ever-present complication. Nonetheless, ideologies played a significant role too, especially now that the revolution had arrived on Corsican shores. Temperamentally, the elite of Corsica were not positively predisposed to the revolution. They remembered Pasquale Paoli, the father of Corsica. He was one of the pillars of traditional Corsica, the other two being the Catholic Church and regional loyalty. Few families had anything good to say about France, much less imported French ideas. The Bonaparte were among the few families to openly support the revolution, despite their strident Corsican nationalism. Napoleone had recognized in the revolution deliverance from the financial woes that had ailed his family since Carlo's death. In this regard, he was joined by Antonio Salicetti. The Salicetti family were originally from Emilia-Romagna and had settled on the northern coast of Corsica. Antonio himself was a lawyer who lived and worked in Bastia, until being elected a representative of the Third Estate in 1789. By 1790, Salicetti had returned to Corsica as a delegate for the National Assembly, again setting up shop in Bastia. The influence of a bona fide revolutionaire in the city of Bastia inspired like minds in Ajaccio. The Bonaparte brothers, 20-year-old Napoleone, 18-year-old Giuseppe, and 14-year-old Lucien, were all infatuated by revolutionary ideals. Lucien himself had joined the Jacobin Club first, later joined by his elder brothers. Together, they publicly extolled the virtues of the revolution and encouraged their countrymen to fly the tricolour and don cockades. The three established a Patriots Club aligned with the Jacobins. Most importantly for Napoleone, he was vital in raising and training an all-volunteer force for the new Corsican National Guard. These efforts were important but time-consuming. Napoleone wrote back to his commander that he would not be back before October 15th. That was again pushed back to some time in the next year. 1791 rolled around, and Napoleone delayed yet again. He was, by then, a very busy boy. Not only was he training the guard, Napoleone was also knee-deep in local elections. Giuseppe was elected mayor of Ajaccio in March, an incredible boon for the family. Elections were a political novelty, not just for Corsica, but indeed all of France, and such things were decided with a good bit of cajoling and a smattering of bribery. Despite this success, the Bonaparte clan were now irrevocably tied to the course of the revolution in Corsica, a project that was about to go tits up with the return of an unexpected guest. Pasquale Paoli ended his 22 years in exile, returning to Corsica in July 1790. Though on paper he was there to reap the rewards of a new and enlightened France, Paoli was in fact on the English payroll and sent to sow dissent in Corsica. Landing in Ajaccio, Paoli was met by a large welcoming committee that included Mayor Giuseppe and Second Lieutenant Napoleone. Both were given the cold shoulder. Paoli's entrance revived dormant Corsican nationalism. His arrival was welcomed by most Corsicans, as only a few weeks before, the National Assembly had promulgated the fateful civil constitution of the clergy. Church properties were nationalised, and all clergymen required to swear an oath of loyalty before becoming state employees. Deeply Catholic Corsica took this about as well as you might expect. Popular discontent was on the verge of boiling over into widespread revolt. Paoli rode this wave of discontent into office, with an uncontested election for the presidency and for overall command of the National Guard. Within the Bonaparte household, Paoli's return was a cause for celebration, even if the man himself wanted nothing to do with them. Giuseppe and Napoleone pulled out all the stops, trying to impress Paoli and ingratiate him to the revolution. But these efforts were futile. At every turn, Paoli conspired to thwart Bonaparte ambitions, working closely with allies in the Botafogo and the Borgo families. Elections to the Corsican Assembly were scheduled for September, and both Napoleone and Giuseppe had their eyes on snagging seats. With a head start as mayor, Giuseppe won his spot. But Napoleone had little support and lost his vote, so instead he turned his sights to the National Guard, hoping to win appointment as an officer. As one of the only military men on the entire island, Napoleone thought his election a sure thing. He was to be bitterly disappointed, however, when he was denied. In October of 1790, the Assembly's round of nationalisation was complete, and they embarked upon their rationalisation campaign. The Ancien Regime's eclectic assemblage of duchies and provinces, each with their own laws and privileges, were rationalized into a system of departments. One of many proposals, this system was primarily the work of the Comte de Mirabeau, who was heralded as a hero in Corsica. This is because Mirabeau, sensitive to the fact that reorganization would amalgamate entire regions, and in so doing pave over local identities, allowed that only Corsicans could govern in Corsica. Napoleone opined. The Patriotic Club would do well to present Mirabeau with a complete Corsican dress. That is to say, a cap, a coat, breeches, dagger, pistol, and gun. It would make a fine impression. There was much in Mirabeau's proposals to enjoy. Paoli and his allies, the Paolisti, were confirmed as rightfully dominant in Corsica, and so wouldn't have to suffer Frenchmen to rule them. Revolutionaries like Napoleone were happy to learn that Corsica would be integrated into the modern French judicial and legal system, which at this very moment was being thoroughly rationalized. But the sheen soon wore off for the Paolisti and other conservatives. They fretted over the increasingly liberal turn of Paris politics. Concern was also raised as to the sanctity of the monarchy. Though he would not admit so publicly, Paoli was no longer a republican, having been convinced by his time in England that monarchy was a natural and inviolable order. However, the revolutionary Bonaparte were emboldened by developments in Paris. On the more radical edge of revolutionary politics, they established another political club and published numerous pamphlets. One such pamphlet, written by Napoleone, lamented the conservatism of the Paolisti government. Napoleone was conciliatory and quick to claim that Paoli was merely misled, not that it mattered. Backlash was immediate and severe. Giuseppe was accused of corruption, and given Bonaparte finances that was quite possibly true, but the affair distracted from revolutionary activity and proved extremely costly. It was in this sorry state of political isolation and financial jeopardy that Napoleone left his family, despite pleading for more time. Having returned home full of optimism about his prospects, Napoleone had not only left empty-handed, but also thoroughly disheartened by Paoli. They do say never meet your heroes. After a 15-month absence, Napoleone rejoined his regiment at Auxonne on February 10, 1791. This time, however, he was not alone. Little Luigi, only 12, had been sent along to France as well, on Napoleone's initiative. The plan was to set the boy on the same path as his elder brother. This path would begin in Auxonne, where Luigi was enrolled in the local seminary, expenses paid by Napoleone. As ever though, money was tight. Only on half pay whilst on leave, Napoleone rationed out 3 months' back pay he'd been given, only taking a single meal a day and sharing a room with Luigi. Life was hard. I lived like a bear in my own little room, Napoleone later said. Books were my only friends. These were the joys and debaucheries of my youth. Not only did Napoleone continue to tear through books, but he also maintained a prodigious output of written works. In 1790, while still residing in Corsica, Napoleone felt inspired to continue on Corsica's history. By June, he had finished a manuscript. He sent out 2 copies, one to his tutor from Brienne, and the other to the most controversial historian of his age, the Abbé Raynal. Neither of the men were impressed. Napoleone's history was light on history, and really more of an expression of his own tortured nationalism, replete with ridiculous hyperbole and patriotic drivel. Fortunately for both, they did not suffer to read Napoleone's other work, The New Corsica, a short story in which Frenchmen are dispatched in terrible ways. It doesn't do to psychoanalyze these works too much, except to say that in his heart, Napoleone was still a Corsican, whilst his outlook was increasingly French. Even on his way to Auxonne, Napoleone wrote, adding entries to his voluminous diary and penning poetry. Only after settling down did Napoleone catch word of an essay writing competition held by the Académie of Lyon on the nature of happiness. Enticed by the 1,200 franc reward and a second chance to impress Raynal, who was one of the judges, Napoleone spent the next 6 months writing. In that time, Luigi's education progressed well. To his family, Napoleone reported, "Luigi is studying hard, learning to write French. I am teaching him mathematics and geometry. He reads history. He has already acquired quite the French manner. I see well enough that he will turn out the best of us 4 brothers." Of course, Napoleone continued to excel in his military duties, though no doubt chafing under the restrictions imposed upon an ambitious young officer in peacetime. Nonetheless, in June he was promoted to first lieutenant and transferred to the 4th Artillery Regiment. This promotion was welcomed, but required relocating to Valence. June was a significant month for other revolutionary reasons. After October 1790, King Louis and his family had been confined to the Tuileries. Ostensibly, this was for their own protection, but it also kept them close to the National Assembly, hopefully complicating any royalist or counter-revolutionary plots. Though stripped of his absolute power, Louis still had a suspensive veto as per the Constitution of 1791. This allowed him to temporarily delay the passing of the civil constitution of the clergy, much to the annoyance of the Assembly. However, Louis had only made this determination after months of idle contemplation, waiting on a decision from the Pope. The king was in an awkward position. He failed to win friends among an assembly desperate for his approval, but Louis also refused to be the focal point for the counter-revolution, instead allowing his brother, the Comte de Provence, to take the lead from his exile in Germany. On assurances from her family, Marie Antoinette pleaded with her husband, asking him to flee France. For months the king refused, until a particularly hair-raising encounter with the mob in April convinced him to flee, if not for himself, then at least to protect his family. In the wee small hours of June 21st, the royal family fled Paris, aided by a number of conspirators. After dawdling through the countryside for a day, they were recognised and apprehended in the village of Varennes-en-Argonne. Though a failure, the flight to Varennes shook the revolution to the core. The National Assembly was now on notice that their figurehead citizen king was completely unreliable. It also altered the diplomatic calculus for Prussia and Austria. Encouraged by Provence and the other exiles, the two great powers of Central Europe cemented a military alliance based upon July's Padua Circular. Napoleon's diary entry of July 27th simply asks, "Is it to be war?" In response to the king's flight and Austrian antagonisms, the mood in revolutionary France was certainly bellicose. Back in February, on his way back to Auxonne, Napoleon had first noticed just how far the revolution had percolated. Quote, "Every peasant stands firm, they are ready to die for the constitution." On July 14th, Napoleon, by now the secretary of the Valence Jacobins, joined in petitioning the Assembly to try the king as a traitor. The following day, however, the moderate constitutional monarchists of the Assembly guaranteed Louis's throne. In response, the Paris sections organised a demonstration. On the Champ de Mars, they signed a petition calling for the king's immediate abdication. In his place, they demanded a republic. For the Assembly, these demands were unconscionable, and they ordered the Marquis de Lafayette and the National Guard to crush the demonstration. The result was the aptly named Massacre of the Champ de Mars. Killing a few dozen demonstrators, however, did the Assembly no good in combating the increasingly popular idea of a republic. Under the guidance of Maximilien Robespierre and Jacques-Pierre Brissot, the Jacobin Club became the underground custodians of republicanism. For his part, Napoleon had been flirting with the idea of a republic even before Varennes. On June 1st, he wrote in his diary, "Royalist orators have undoubtedly done much to discredit the monarchy, for having spent all their breath on empty argumentation, they invariably finish up by decreeing that a republic is impossible simply because it is impossible." I think it's safe to say that Napoleon's eventual decisive turn toward republicanism was not born at least entirely out of opportunism, as critics have often claimed. He was too deep of a thinker and far too familiar with Roman history to not have seriously considered the implications of a republic for France. It might seem out of character for Napoleon to advocate democracy, considering his later authoritarianism, but to him these two ideas were not contradictory. As the Ancien regime broke down, a republic promised a viable alternative, and one that would restore Napoleon's core political principle that there must be order, whether it be an order under a king or under an elected assembly. Here Rousseau's influence was profound, and Napoleon rationalised republics as a more natural state under which mankind could exist than that of any monarchical rule of one. But to say that his ideas were set in stone at this stage would be patently false. That essay he'd been writing didn't look particularly Napoleonic. In it, he decried ambition as foolish. Moreover, that power breeds contempt. As always, the language was bolshy and over the top. Needless to say, Napoleon did not win the 1200 francs, but it had taken balls to even try in the first place. Fired up by revolution, and quite possibly the chance to see some action, Napoleon was restless. He noted to a friend that the lower ranks of the officer corps, the ones who had stuck around at least, and indeed most of the rank and file, were, like the nation, quote, seized with zeal and fire. But action was a little ways off for now, as once again Napoleon was running into serious money troubles. He had wanted to go to Paris in July to see if he could tie up some loose ends, but the plan fell through for lack of funds. Now in August, Napoleon wanted to go back to Corsica to shore up his family finances. Urgency was implied by Giuseppe's reports on the escalating violence on the island. The commander of the regiment, however, refused the request for leave on very reasonable grounds. Not only had Napoleone been absent for literally half of his time in service, but war with Austria was on the horizon. It took a personal favour from General Duthai to secure Napoleone's leave. Should he fail to return by January of 1792, Napoleone need not return at all. He would be considered a deserter. Napoleone proceeded to ignore these warnings. Just as Giuseppe had suggested, Napoleone returned to Corsica, only to find his homeland riven by fratricidal infighting. The Paolisti were politically ascendant, withholding taxes and intimidating revolutionaries as a prelude to outright independence. It was only in Ajaccio that the revolution seemed alive and well. Giuseppe had partially recovered from his corruption scandal, and the Patriotic Club continued to meet. However, the Buonaparte was still deep in the red. Despite a change in government, debts owed to the state was still owed. In an incredible stroke of luck for the Buonaparte, they came into some money. An elderly uncle who had served as an archdeacon died in mid-October. His entire fortune was bequeathed to the Buonaparte family. With his family's financial situation secured, it only remained for Napoleone to secure their political future. But here the prospects were dim. Elections for a vacant colonelcy in the 2nd Battalion of the Corsica National Guard were due for February. One of Paoli's many friends among the powerful Borgo family, Matteo Borgo, was the front-runner for appointment. But Napoleone, supported by Salicetti, was determined to finally win an office for himself. In this fight, he had 3 key advantages: political support offered by the Patriotic Club, a plush war chest, and absolutely no scruples about democratic pretense. Administrators were bribed, and partisans sent out to intimidate Borgo's supporters. In one instance, Borgo was threatened by armed partisans during an abortive public speech. On the day of the election, 3 election officials were, shall we say, entertained against their will at the Casa Bonaparte, until Napoleone was sure that the election had gone his way. Such a flagrantly fraudulent election was, even by Corsican standards, pretty poor form. Paoli quite justifiably demanded the Corsican Assembly investigate these happenings. Salicetti blocked the proposal. Napoleone had won. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Corsican Guard. But he was now indebted to Salicetti, and Salicetti called in that debt less than a week after the election. Nationalisation of church lands and properties, as decreed by the National Assembly, had failed to progress very far in Corsica. Not only was nationalisation unpopular among the people, but the Paolisti had effectively blockaded any attempts. By February, however, Salicetti felt ready to make his play. With his own loyal guard units in Bastia, and Napoleone's guard in Ajaccio, Salicetti expected that the 2 major population centres on the island could be definitively secured for the revolution. Well, at least that was the hope. On February 28th, church properties in Ajaccio and Bastia, as well as Bonifacio and Corte, were nationalised. Almost immediately there was an intense backlash, as Catholic Corsicans took up arms to defend the church. At a monastery in Ajaccio, Napoleone's guard was surrounded by an angry mob. Shots were fired and a guard officer was killed. Moving quickly, Napoleone attempted to restore order, but was unable to effectively quash the rioters. He likely called for reinforcements from his superior, Colonel Maillard, the commander of the French garrison holding Corte's citadel. However, Maillard was sympathetic to the rioters, and a Paolisti to boot. Denied aid, Napoleone made an ill-advised attempt to seize the citadel. At this, Maillard fumed, demanding Napoleone report to him at once. After addressing down, Napoleone expected to be either deported, arrested, or stripped of command. Certainly Maillard expected as much. He'd sent letters to the Ministry of War, reporting on Napoleone's heinous conduct. These demands, however, went unanswered, and Maillard was forced to let Napoleone go. Napoleone didn't linger long in Corsica, knowing full well that he would likely meet the hangman if he did stick around. But a return to France was similarly inadvisable. Having failed to return to his regiment by January, he was officially a deserter. Of the 2 options, Napoleone chose to return to France. He was back in Paris on May 28, 1792. His goal was to smooth things over with the Ministry of War. But of course, as it's now May, France was in a bit of a bind. The dissolution of the National Assembly in 1791, and its subsequent replacement by the Legislative Assembly, made space for the well-organised Jacobins to rise to political prominence. Here, however, their fortunes had reversed. Concerns over how to deal with the problem of émigrés conspiring against France from within nearby states divided the Jacobin. One camp, under the hawkish Brissot, advocated war with the minor Holy Roman states of Trier and Mainz if they failed to oust the émigrés. Robespierre, on the other hand, knew France ill-prepared to wage war. Fatefully for France, Trier and Mainz capitulated, but not before Austria threatened to intervene. Having decisively split from the Jacobin, and taking a vast majority of the club with him, Brissot formed the Girondin faction, and bored on war fever, they declared war on Austria in February. France was now embroiled in a major war with former ally Austria and their partner Prussia. The opening French offensive was an embarrassing failure, leaving the frontiers wide open to a counterattack. Now the Ministry of War was reeling, desperately attempting to stabilise the front and reform a badly dysfunctional army as coalition forces cracked French fortresses at Longwy, Valenciennes and Lille. In such a state of turmoil, the Ministry of War quite literally did not care about Napoleone's Corsican capers. As a young officer ready to serve, his desertion was quietly ignored, and he was restored in rank and pay. But this took time to process, leaving Napoleone time to kill in Paris, right at the moment when popular discontent was about to forever alter the course of the revolution. He wrote in his diary on May 29th, "Paris is in a state of grave agitation. The National Guard on duty to protect the king at the Tuileries have been doubled. There is a vast amount of desertion among army officers. From every point of view, the situation is critical." How right he was. At the peak of their agitation for the king and the royal family, the sans-culottes mounted a journée on June 20th. The inciting reasons for this journée are many and varied, but between the flight to Varennes, royal intrigue with counter-revolutionaries, and a crisis atmosphere propelled by disaster at the front, there were plenty of reasons for Parisians to be pissed. Napoleon had caught up with his old friend from Brienne, Louis Bourrienne, at a restaurant along the Rue Saint-Honoré. The path the sans-culottes took from the eastern faubourgs carried them right down the Saint-Honoré. From their balcony view, Napoleon surveyed the armed masses. In a letter home to Giuseppe, he recounted subsequent events. "Let us follow this rabble. 7,000 to 8,000 men, armed with pikes, axes, swords, guns, spits, pointed sticks, marched to the assembly to present a petition. Thence they proceeded to the king. The garden of the Tuileries was closed, and was guarded by 15,000 National Guard. The mob broke down the gates, entered the palace, smashed through 4 doors, and presented the king with 2 cockades, one white and the other tricolour. Choose, they said, reign here or at Coblentz. The king withstood it well, and placed a red cap upon his head." This seminal event in the history of the revolution signalled the death of King Louis's regal image. Though he won some plaudits for remaining calm in the face of danger, the lasting impression France received was of a disloyal king, impermanent in his convictions, who only assented to the revolution on pain of death. Bourrienne and Napoleone had viewed the entire day from within the crowd, waiting on the wings by the Seine. And for his part, Napoleone was dumbfounded that Louis had allowed himself to be so thoroughly humiliated. In later years, Bourrienne recounted Napoleone's words. "Madness! How could they let the rabble enter the palace grounds? They ought to have mown down 400 or 500 of them with cannon, and the others would still be running." At times, this quote has been taken out of context, and used to depict Napoleone early on as a destined military dictator. But bear in mind that Napoleone is still very young and zealous, in addition to being a trained soldier who has been on the wrong end of armed mobs before, in Valence, in Auxonne, and most recently, Ajaccio. Certainly, the core of his political belief, in order even when maintained by violence, is on full display. But I think the more interesting insight is Napoleone's fixation upon the humiliation of Louis, as opposed to his failure to resort to force. What we might call the impression of the state, its inviolability, its supremacy, its majesty, Napoleon would come to realise maintained order far more effectively and bloodlessly than any violent repression. That's why Louis' humiliation was so vexing. Unwillingness to use force might be cowardly, but bowing so easily was impotence. Quite correctly, Napoleon predicted, "When I was told that Louis had put a red cap on his head, I concluded that his reign was over." For in politics, an act that degrades can never be lived down. Safe to say, Napoleon was no fan of the king. But what about the revolutionaries he met in Paris? Here too opinions were poor. The prevailing military crisis was another act that degrades, and it appeared to Napoleon that the Legislative Assembly was not well suited to the business of waging war. Instead, what Napoleon saw was that petty factional divides imperiled the war effort. On July 3rd he recorded, "I am bound to say that our leaders are a poor lot. Each one pursues his own individual interest and tries to excel in the horrors. Intrigues are today as base as they ever were. It is enough to destroy all ambition." Napoleon's quiet disillusionment was somewhat deadened by this prime opportunity to experience all the wonders of Paris. From his lodgings on the Rue de Mail, he visited the theatre and the opera, and pursued a hobby in astronomy. With my knowledge of mathematics, he noted, it took very little effort to learn. It is a fine skill to have acquired. In July of 1792, a general suppression of the Jacobins occurred. Ascendant Girondins muzzled Jacobin press, and the club hemorrhaged supporters, only remaining viable due to the momentous efforts of Robespierre. However, despite innovation among the political revolutionaries, popular discontent with the king was at an all-time high. Popular forces were only weeks away from reaching the high watermark of the social revolution. On August 10th, the faubourgs again erupted with thousands of sans-culottes. This time they were far better armed and organised. The first Napoleon heard of the Journée was, by his own account, the tocsin bells ringing out across the city. He raced to the Place du Carrousel, nearby the Tuileries. On the way there, he was accosted by some sans-culottes who were carrying a head on a pike. Napoleon was in a dangerous spot. Quote, thinking I looked too much like a gentleman, they wanted me to shout Vive la Nation. This I promptly did, as may easily be imagined. Then, from a friend's furniture storehouse along the Rue du Carrousel, Napoleon watched the assault on the Tuileries unfold. In his final years, he recounted what he saw that day. The palace was being attacked by the vilest rabble. After the palace had been captured, and the king had withdrawn to the assembly, I ventured cautiously into the gardens. Never since that day, nor on all my battlefields, have I had such an impression of masses of dead men as the Swiss then produced on me. After this watershed event, Louis and his family were confined to the Square du Temple while the revolution rumbled on. As September rolled around, Napoleon was still in the capital. On the 1st, his 16-year-old sister, Elisa, joined him in Paris. She had been at a college in Saint-Cyr until August, when it was shut down. Now, she and her brother contemplated a return to Corsica. But before they could do so, the prisons were thrown open, and over 1,000 executed in an episode that became known as the September Massacres. Napoleon offered a cautious defense of the massacres, noting correctly that the event was triggered by a military emergency. Even so, he hastened to leave Paris. It took about a month for Napoleon and Elisa to navigate their way down to Corsica. In that time, the Duke of Brunswick broke the defences at Verdun and plunged into France. On September 20th, General Francois Kellermann repulsed Brunswick's Austro-Prussian army in a battle near the village of Vimy. Losing his nerve, and with his army afflicted by camp diseases, Brunswick retreated. France had endured. The following day, by assembly decree, the French Republic was established. France no longer had a king. This incredible news followed brother and sister south. They arrived back in Corsica by October 15th. Napoleon's first move was to resume his posting as lieutenant colonel in the Corsican National Guard. Immediately, there was trouble. On the 18th, Maillard sent for Napoleon, likely at Paoli's insistence. Though Maillard protested Napoleon's reinstatement, the fact that no official reprimand had ever been issued left his hands tied. After this cold reception, Napoleon was stationed in Ajaccio and its surrounds, maintaining the tenuous peace between royalists, revolutionaries, and Corsican nationalists. The Paolisti were by now moving decisively towards support for the dethroned king. Napoleon, and the Bonaparte more generally, continued to champion the revolutionary cause, particularly the Jacobin cause. Unfortunately for the Bonaparte, this overt support put them on the wrong side of the great political dividing line in Corsica, should Corsica again be independent. Though the Bonaparte had long been Corsican nationalists, and indeed still viewed themselves as loyal Corsicans, their assertion was that Corsica was better off with France. Alone, Corsica would be dominated either by Spain or Britain, and the benefits of French law and progress were obvious to Napoleon, Giuseppe, and Lucien, by now all quiet Francophiles. But pro-French sympathies became dangerous political scruples to bear after the death of the king. Citizen Capet's trial and execution severely strained the tattered bonds of national kinship that once bound Corsica's revolutionaries and her royalists. Nonetheless, with the war on, they managed to keep things civil. The young republic was now at war with Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, Sardinia Piedmont, Naples, Portugal, Tuscany, as well as half a dozen minor German principalities. With this grand continent-wide war, the newly inaugurated National Convention ordered the Corsicans to launch their own minor campaign against Sardinia. Surprise, surprise, but the island of Sardinia was a constituent part of Sardinia Piedmont, and between Corsica and Sardinia were three small islands, Caprera, San Stefano, and La Maddalena, which gives the small chain its name. The French Mediterranean fleet was to launch attacks on Sardinian ports, while units from Corsica landed and occupied the Maddalena chain. Strapped for cash, the convention expected the poorly defended island to be taken with only a minimal military investment. Paoli and his lot scoffed when it was demanded of them that they raise and equip 10,000 men. But for Paoli, this was an opportunity in disguise, an excellent chance to get National Guard and regular army out of Corsica, especially her valuable ports, and discredit the convention. Around 2,000 men, mostly Provençal peasants, voluntold to go and enlist, were hastily organised. Supplies were minimal, no tents, no boots, little food or ammunition. Command was given over to Paoli's nephew, the spineless Pierre de Rocca. In other words, the expedition was deliberately set up to fail. Napoleone and his volunteer unit embarked upon the brig La Fauvette on February 18th. The initial landing went well, and San Stefano was taken on the 23rd without incident. After ranging his cannons, Napoleone began to bombard the defences at Caprera and Maddalena. Predictably, however, the operation was a bust. The troops began to mutiny, and Rocca ordered a retreat. For Napoleone, his first experience of real action had been a disappointing failure. But it was, as indeed were many of his greatest failures, a chance to reflect. The importance of supply, morale, and perhaps most interestingly of all, good maps, Napoleone identified as reasons for the operation's failure. At this time, he was unaware that Paoli had sabotaged the operation. For Napoleone, Paoli was still the father, his character beyond reproach. But Salicetti was under no such illusions. Likely on his request, a representative on mission was dispatched to Corsica. Napoleone publicly defended Paoli, only to find that Paoli still despised the Buonaparte. For his entire life, Napoleone had revered Paoli, loved the man and the ideas he embodied. But those ideas now conflicted with the revolutionary ideas Napoleone not only found more compelling, but more conducive to his family's fortunes. Loyalty to Corsica and to Paoli, even for Napoleone, had a limit. That limit was reached in late April. Convinced of Paoli's double dealing, Salicetti ordered him arrested. The attempt failed, and Paoli fled to the mountains, as the island, almost as one, rose in his defence. Bastia and a few port towns held out, if only barely, as they had regular garrisons, but Ajaccio was not so lucky. Napoleone tried to induce the citizens to take an oath to the Republic. But before long the locals were up in arms. His own guard were defecting too. Facing this dire threat, the Bonaparte retired from public life. They departed Ajaccio in early May. Napoleone went ahead, alone, and on the way to Bastia, was intercepted not far from Ajaccio. His captors were bandits loyal to Paoli, and much like Caesar's close call with pirates, Napoleone refused to be intimidated. Fortunately, local villagers from a Buonaparte estate rescued Napoleone and sent him on his way. Before long, he was in Bastia, and joined his family. At this stage, a flight from Corsica was probably still far from Napoleone's mind. But this nightmare scenario became a reality when Paoli, by now restored to power, induced the Corsican parliament to outlaw the Buonaparte. On May 23rd, the Casa Buonaparte was raided by Paolisti. About a week later, Napoleone participated in a failed attempt to recapture Ajaccio. This dismal state of affairs, Napoleone recorded in a report meant for the convention. In this tract, Napoleone finally broke with Paoli. In the end, it was not years of studious contempt, nor even Paoli's royalist loyalties, that had finally purged Napoleone of his patriotic attachment to Corsica and to Paoli. It was instead a realization that Corsica was just an island. Its horizons were narrow, its squabbles petty. The vivacity, the impetus, and the promises of the revolution were where Napoleon Bonaparte saw his future, and that future lay across the sea. On June 11th, he and his family boarded the Proselite in the port of Calvi. They set sail for France.